Welcome to Inside the CEO, and the special guest today is Andrea Cattaneo, who's CEO at Zenith Energy. How are you today, Andrea?
Very well, and you?
Well, I'm very well too. Purpose of this particular exercise is to dig a little bit deeper into the CEOs of the companies that we've spoken to before. You've obviously been on the show. Zenith is a Azerbaijan-focused oil and gas company. Strange part of the world. How did you find it?
Well, you know, not for me. I have been there many times in my previous life as a banker. And indeed, I think it's very interesting what you're doing, because we are the result of 1,000 days of experience in one way or the other in our previous careers when we started to work. Most important time in life, 20, 22, 25, and then a lot of impression form your future framework of your attitude toward business and counterparties and countries where you go. So my first job was in Moscow, trading technical material, and with the Soviet big combinat of these days of USSR, which was producing technical equipment. And then I started to love this part of the world, traveling to republics that were members of Soviet Union, so Azerbaijan, which then I encountered now in my life, and Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, and then...
How have those places changed since the Soviet times? Because you know, I was born with that, and the USSR. I wouldn't say it was glamorous, but it was perhaps maybe not even, well, compared to now with Putin, it's a different world, isn't it? It was a different world.
Well, it's a different world, maybe not as a structure of laws and society, but very much in sense of attitude of the individual. First of all, the people were much more sober. There were very few rich people, and nobody that was rich was visible to be rich. There was a hidden establishment, nomenclatura, wealth, but there was not visible. You know, it was a socialist country, everybody equal. And there was a very large sense of brotherhood. You could see in my visit, I was a banker then, a few years later, and so I was visiting Moscow, but meeting Cuban, Polish, Vietnamese, Bulgarian, Romanian, so it was a real...
You were doing business at what seems to be a very difficult time. It was like, it was clearly like a frontier market, let's say. Or an emerging market, or it was a market which wasn't even supposed to be emerging. But I mean, the Soviet Union then, it strikes me if you could make money or do business in those times, in the 70s or 80s or before, you can make money anywhere. You can't think of a harder environment to do business.
No, on the contrary. And was one of the most stable borrower. Soviet Union was 50% of the world power, was at the moment of its peak of apparent strength. The margin for credit, for loans to Soviet Union were very low, and was a very competitive market because all the major banks were there competing to lend money to Soviet Union. Americans, British, French, Italian, they were all pouring money into Soviet Union, which was a very stable debtor. This until 1985. Then the system of Soviet Union started to crumble, and then the situation became different. But
so it turned into the Wild West, basically. It went from being a stable nation to being the Wild West in the 80s and 90s.
90s.
Sounds like it was better before.
But better before, certainly. In the period in which I was banking there, was a very pleasant business, and very pleasant as well life. Everything was very well structured. Of course, now with Gorbachev, we discovered the various problems that there were in their society, and then eventually this problem exploded. There was then the end of Soviet Union and the start of separate countries, like in 1991 Azerbaijan. So they are very interesting process, and in this life there, you know, you work especially in certain Nordic towns, Moscow, Oslo, till 5 o'clock maximum, 5, 6 o'clock. Then people, it's very dark, they go home and the business stop. Then you have a lot of time to appreciate the local culture and to meet people.
Drink vodka.
Drink vodka. Eventually you must, because it's so cold in certain period of the year, that you may be forced to gel with them, drinking the same spirit. And
so basically, I mean, in terms of the Azerbaijan experience, you were fully educated and prepared for working there and being part of the furniture.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
now.
Yes. And especially because what I enjoy very much when I went to Azerbaijan before was the difference, the deep difference between them and their cousin in Moscow. So the physical difference, attitude difference, spending difference, while the Russian counterparts were very sober and dressed in a very sort of somber way. The local Azeri with much more happy and colorful. You know, the presence of the sunshine and of the sea has tremendous impact in the personality of people and the character and the mood. And so I met them, I met the Kazaki. On those days especially, it was nearly compulsory for people of Azerbaijan to be in high position, to be relocated in other part of the empire. So there were Azeri people in Ukraine, Ukrainian people in Moscow, and Kazakh people in St. Petersburg. So a lot of mix of different nationalities and breeds. And so it was very interesting to meet these differences, which were physical and psychological.
You're obviously a different breed from the locals there as well. Presumably you came from Italy, but how do you? What's the story from Italy going to the Soviet Union? What was your background before that?
Well, you know, as an opportunity, I studied economics, and then I had the opportunity to know a family friend, which was the family Savoretti. Savoretti family was the arranger and broker of the first big deal between Italy and Soviet Union, when Agnelli, the owner of Fiat, agreed, astonishing the Western world, with the Soviet automobile headquarters to make a factory of Fiat in Russia, which was called Tolyattigrad, in the name of a famous communist leader of the 50s and the war period. And so that was a tremendous deal, and this person, this Genoese family, became very well known. So working with their assistance permitted me to enter an interesting opportunity in Moscow, and then to make very interesting days for a young man. Then living in Moscow was not really what I was planning to do in my life, so I found a job in London, and because of you remain a slave to your past, because of my days in Moscow, I was hired by a bank lending money to communist countries.
And how did you find, I mean, this is the final question, how do you find your interests and activities outside business help what you do?
It helps tremendously. You know, if you finish when you are in a business assignment overseas, staying in your hotel room and going to bed and reading a book, you lose the best days and the best intelligence in the country. You know, going through some common friends, which can be the embassy, if you are not lucky.
I mean, in terms of your other interests in life, I mean, for instance, I know you do charitable work and other things like that. Does that lead into business? Is that related to it? I mean, does it help you get on with people? I mean, how does that work?
Well, you know various people. For example, through charitable work, you may meet the most poor people in the country, and then you may meet other people of great importance and wealth that are as well making charitable assistance. So this generosity has always strange ways to remunerate the people doing it. But generally, even if you don't do, which in Russia was not the case, any charitable work, you meet people that eventually, during the night, open up and speak about the reality of the society. So through banks and through embassies, you know 25% of the story. And then through common people, important or less important, you know the other 75% of the story. And so more you expose yourself to local people, more you know what you're dealing with, so you enhance your professionalism at work. Because if you are sent by a big corporation to do a business trip, what you know is what you read in The Economist, in the Newsweek, and then sometimes it's just a gloss, negative or positive, normally negative, about the country without a real understanding of the true reality.
Speaking of the negatives, I mean, what are the negative experiences you've had? What have you learned from them? I mean, could you tell us about those?
Well, you know, first of all, press. The most important thing is that you have to be very far from any sort of exposure. I think that the best for an entrepreneur is to be very low profile and not to expose himself too much to articles or to comments or whatever. I understand that now in the digital marketing of listed companies, there is the need to be very much communicating with shareholders, but this should be done, I believe, with a great humility and the sense of duty, serving the company rather than serving your ego, because ego is a very dangerous aspect of personality. And so indeed, myself, for example, I left then banking because I made the first loan. It happened that I made the first loan in history to Vietnam, which was the poorest of the socialist countries and the third poorest country in the world. This was quite a lucky, extraordinary event for the country, and so they were very thankful, and they proposed to me to trade their oil, which of course for a bank director was very alien and very strange, even funny. Nevertheless, 1 year later, I came back to them and they said, is still valid this offer? And they said, yes. Time went very slowly in those days in Vietnam. And so I accepted and I left the bank and I started an activity as an energy entrepreneur. And since I've been entrepreneur, always linked to overseas market and production. So in Vietnam, I started with oil and textile. Then I had a period in which I was manufacturing textile. In England, I had in UK, I had the Scottish company of which I was CEO. That was the most important producer of tartan, which was quite a special.
Surprising, I would say. Yes.
Surprising, yes, special. And then after that, I was the CEO of what became the largest British producer of socks. And unfortunately, this didn't turn well, because after growing from 100 employees to 2,000 employees, eventually it went in administration. So here you are, what I said before about press. There was then a nasty article about the demise of PEX, and that remained for years a sort of negative omen of my life. And it's very interesting that when you have such a one-day banana skin, one-day accident, this can be changing your life forever. And then because today news, they are not like 20 years ago, going to cover eggs in the market, in the local market a few days later, but remain eternal.
You can Google them eternally.
Eternally.
I mean, the final thing, I mean, you are involved in the markets, the oil market especially. Do you think the markets are now over-regulated and central banks interfering with flows of money? Is that, do you think that's a bad thing, or do you think that that's a necessity that we have to live with?
Well, you know, the regulations are tremendous, but at the same time, if we compare the money that we were trading with the lending to central bank, to the largest bank, for example, the Soviet Union, there were 100, 200, $500 million. Today, this amount of money are considered for more small corporations. The enormous amount of liquidity injected worldwide in the market has made such results that we are trading enormous amount of figures, and so then regulations, they attempt to control everything, but in reality the animal of liquidity is everywhere, anywhere, and is making deals rampant and very difficult to control. So it is a catch-22 situation in which regulators become more complicated every day, and then the business become more buoyant every day. It's a very interesting situation.
Unfortunately, time has caught up with us, so we'll have to leave it there. But Andrea Cattaneo, CEO of Zenith Energy, thanks very much for coming in today.
Thank you for inviting me.